The wind over the Black Ridge Mountains doesn't just howl. It screams with the voices of those the kingdom forgot. In the heart of the ironwood forest, the air has turned unnaturally cold. The frost creeping across the silver-leafed trees isn't from the season. It's from a memory of a girl who crawled through these very woods 3 years ago, her chest a hollow cavern where a mating bond had been brutally severed. They say when an alpha king rejects his fated mate, the soul shatters. Most women fade away. They become ghosts in their own skin, wandering until their hearts simply stop beating. But as the moon rises, blood-red and heavy against the horizon, it becomes clear that Elara Vance did not fade. She didn't just survive the silence of the bond. She mastered it. And tonight, as King Valerius sits upon a throne built on the bones of his enemies, he feels a shiver he hasn't felt in 1,000 years. A familiar scent, white lilies and ozone, is drifting through the vents of his fortress. It's the scent of the woman he broke. Only now it's laced with the metallic tang of something far more dangerous. The Queen of Shadows has come home, and she isn't looking for an apology. She's looking for a crown. The great hall of the Black Ridge Pack was a cathedral of obsidian and ego. Valerius sat motionless, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, lethal beat against the arm of his throne. He was a man carved from granite and bad intentions. As the Alpha King, his word was law, his sent a suffocating weight that kept every high-ranking wolf in the room bowed. But for the last hour, his wolf had been packing behind his ribs, snarling at a ghost. "Report," Valerius commanded. His voice was a low-frequency growl that vibrated in the floorboards. "The northern border was breached at dawn, sire," General Kalen said, his head lowered. "No casualties, but they didn't steal cattle or gold. They left this." Kalen stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he placed a small, scorched object on the dais. It was a mating silk, a delicate, hand-woven ribbon that every female of the pack wore on her nomming day. This one was charred black, but the embroidery was still visible. The initials EV were stitched in silver thread. Valerius felt the air leave the room. He remembered the day he had ripped that very silk from Elara's throat. He remembered the way her eyes, once a vibrant, hopeful gold, had turned dull and gray as he told her she was too weak to stand beside him. "A king needs a sword, Elara, not a heartbeat," he had told her. He had watched her stumble into the blizzard, certain she wouldn't make it past the first tree line. "Where did you find it?" Valerius asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Pinned to the chest of your lead scout," Kalen whispered. "He wasn't harmed, sire, but he was asleep. A sleep we cannot wake him from. It's not wolf magic. It's something older, something from the void." Valerius stood, and the sheer pressure of his aura sent several Omegas to their knees at the back of the hall. He stepped down to the silk, picking it up. It didn't smell like the girl he remembered. It didn't smell like the sweet, frightened Omega who used to bring him wildflowers. It smelled like ash. It smelled like the deep, crushing pressure of the ocean. "She's back," Valerius murmured to the empty air. His court looked at him in confusion. Most of them had forgotten Elara. To them, she was a footnote, a mistake the king had corrected. But Valerius felt the phantom ache in his chest, the place where his soul had been cauterized. He had spent 3 years convincing himself that he had done the right thing for his kingdom. A king must be ruthless. A king cannot have a weakness that can be used against him. But as he stared at the scorched silk, a terrifying thought took root in his mind. He hadn't removed his weakness. He had weaponized it. 5 miles away, beneath the canopy of the ironwood, Elara stood in a clearing that had once been her sanctuary. She looked nothing like the girl who had fled. Her hair, once long and chestnut, was now a shock of stark white, falling like a shroud around her shoulders. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, etched with glowing faint blue runes that pulsed with the rhythm of her breath. She reached out a hand, touching the bark of an ancient oak. The tree groaned, its leaves turning black and curling into dust at her touch. "Patience," she whispered. Her voice had changed. It was no longer a melody, it was a resonance, deep and layered as if three people were speaking at once. "The king likes his ceremonies, we shall give him one." Behind her, the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the trees. 5 figures emerged, cloaked in rags that seemed to be made of literal darkness. They were the Hallowed, warriors who had been cast out, rejected, and broken, just as she had been. They didn't follow her because she was an alpha. They followed her because she was the end of alphas. "The perimeter is set, my lady," one of the Hallowed said, his voice a dry rasp. "The king's scouts are blinded. They see only what you allow them to see." Elara turned, her eyes glowing with a cold, ethereal light. There was no gold left in them, only the silver of a dead moon. "He thinks he knows what pain is," Elara said, looking toward the distant spires of the Black Ridge fortress. "He thinks he felt a sting when he tore the bond. But Valerius has lived 1,000 years in a world that bowed to him. He doesn't understand that the greatest power isn't found in a throne." She clenched her fist, and the air around her fractured, tiny hairline cracks appearing in reality itself. "It's found in the moment you realize you have nothing left to lose." Back in the fortress, the night cycle had begun, but no one was sleeping. Valerius was in his private study, the walls lined with ancient maps and weapons of war. He was packing, his predatory instincts screaming at him. The bond, the one he had supposedly destroyed, was twitching. It shouldn't be possible. A rejection is final. The goddess herself seals the break. But he could feel a tugging at his sternum. It wasn't the warm, honeyed pull of a mate. It was a cold, iron hook dragging him toward the woods. "Come to me," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. Valerius slammed his fists onto his desk, the heavy oak splitting down the middle. "Get out of my head." "Sire." He turned to see his sister, Lyra, standing in the doorway. She was one of the few who dared to speak to him without permission. Her expression was etched with worry. "Valerius, the guards are reporting strange sightings on the battlements. They say the shadows are moving against the wind, and the wolves, the younger ones, are howling in their sleep. They're calling out a name." Valerius felt a cold sweat break across his neck. "What name?" Lyra hesitated, her voice dropping to a breathy whisper. "They're calling for the Pale Queen." "There is no Pale Queen," Valerius spat, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "There is only a ghost I should have killed 3 years ago." "Did you really think she would just die?" Lyra asked, stepping into the room. "You didn't just reject her, Val. You threw her to the wastes. No one survives the wastes unless they make a deal with something in the dark. If that's Elara out there, she isn't your mate anymore." Valerius grabbed his leather cloak, his eyes flashing a dangerous, feral crimson. "She was never my mate. She was a flaw in the design. I am going to finish what I started. I'm going into the woods." "Alone," Lyra stepped back. "That's what she wants. Can't you feel it? It's a lure." "I am the Alpha King," Valerius growled, his body already beginning the painful, partial shift that heightened his senses. "Nothing in these woods has the power to lure me unless I allow it." As he stormed past her, Lyra watched him go, a sense of impending doom settling over her. She looked down at the floor where Valerius had been standing. The frost was there, too. A perfect, icy footprint in the shape of a wolf's paw, but with jagged, monstrous claws that no natural wolf possessed. The forest was silent. Valerius moved through the undergrowth like a shadow, his boots making no sound on the frozen earth. His senses were dialed to the absolute limit. He could hear the heartbeat of a squirrel 3 miles away. He could smell the sap running slow in the trees. But he couldn't find her. The scent of lilies and ozone was everywhere and nowhere. It was as if the forest itself was exhaling her name. "Elara," he roared, the sound shattering the silence, sending a flock of crows into the air. "Show yourself. Stop hiding behind these parlor tricks." The wind died down instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. "Hiding." The voice didn't come from any one direction. It came from the ground, the trees, and the air. It was a soft, mocking caress. "I spent 18 years hiding in your shadow, Valerius. I spent 18 years trying to be small enough, quiet enough, and sweet enough for you to love me." A figure began to shimmer into existence 20 feet in front of him. She didn't walk out from behind a tree. She simply assembled herself from the moonlight. Valerius froze. His wolf, usually a mindless beast of rage, whimpered. She was beautiful, but it was a terrifying, lethal beauty. She looked like a goddess of winter and war. The blue runes on her skin glowed brighter as she stepped closer, her bare feet touching the frozen ground. With every step, flowers made of ice bloomed in her wake. "Elara," Valerius breathed. His hand went instinctively to the hilt of his dagger, but his fingers felt numb. "The king remembers my name," she said, tilting her head. Her white hair caught the moonlight, shimmering like spun silver. "I'm honored. I assumed you had replaced me with someone sturdier, someone who could carry your airs without breaking." "How are you alive?" Valerius demanded, stepping toward her. He tried to summon his alpha command, the voice that could force any wolf to submit. "Kneel." The power rolled off him in a visible wave of golden energy. It hit her full force. Elara didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply watched the wave of energy dissipate against her skin like mist against a mountain. "That power works on wolves, Valerius," she said softly. She took another step, her eyes locking onto his. "But I haven't been a wolf for a very long time. You tore that part of me away, remember? You broke the spirit that connected me to the pack." She was so close now, he could smell the cold radiating off her. "You want to know what I am?" she whispered, reaching up. Her fingers trailed lightly along his jawline. Her touch was searingly cold, like dry ice. "I am the consequence of your pride. I am every soul you discarded to keep your throne. I am the dark you were so afraid of." Valerius grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to crush bone. But it felt like holding a pillar of marble. "You're a threat to my people," he growled, though his heart was racing for a different reason. Up close, the bond, or whatever was left of it, was screaming. It wasn't a broken thing. It was a tether, and she was pulling on it. "I should kill you where you stand." Elara smiled, and it was the saddest, sharpest thing he had ever seen. "You can try, but you'll find that I'm much harder to kill when I'm not trying to please you." Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The shadows of the trees stretched out, wrapping around Valerius's ankles like living vines. He tried to pull away, but the shadows were solid, anchoring him to the spot. "What is this?" he snarled, his claws extending as he slashed at the darkness. "This is the beginning of the end of your kingdom," Elara said, stepping back into the mist. "Tonight, I didn't come to kill you, Valerius. If I killed you now, you would die a king. You would be a martyr." She faded into the gray, her voice echoing as she disappeared. "I'm going to take everything from you first. I'm going to watch you crawl in the dirt just like I did. And when you have nothing left, not a crown, not a pack, not even your name, then, and only then, will I allow you to die. Elara, return here." But she was gone. The shadows retracted, leaving Valerius alone in the silent woods. He stood there for a long time, his breath hitching in the cold air. He looked down at his hand, the one that had gripped her wrist. There, etched into his skin in frost, was a single rune. It was the symbol for betrayal. And it was beginning to burn. The next morning, the Black Ridge Kingdom woke to a world that had changed. It wasn't a violent change, not yet, but the sun didn't seem to reach the valley floor. A thick, silver mist clung to the houses and the wells. The water in the wells had turned as black as ink. Valerius stood on the balcony of his war room, watching the panic begin to stir in the streets below. He hadn't slept. The rune on his hand was now a deep, bruised purple, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elara's white hair and her cold, dead eyes. "The healers can't remove it," Kaelin said, standing behind him. "They say it's woven into your life force. Sire, the council is demanding answers. They've heard the rumors. They know she's back." "Let them talk," Valerius said, his voice raspy. "Summon the elite guard. We're burning the forest." "Sire," Kaelin looked horrified. "The ironwood is sacred. Our ancestors are buried there. The spirits are gone." Valerius turned, his eyes wild. "There is only her. She is using the woods as a battery. If I have to turn this entire mountain to ash to smoke her out, I will." "You would destroy our history to kill one woman." Valerius gripped the stone railing, the rock cracking under his strength. "She isn't a woman. She's a plague. Did you see the water? Did you see the sky? She's suffocating us." But as he spoke, a horn sounded from the southern gate. It wasn't a war horn. It was a herald's cry. Valerius and Kaelin hurried to the battlements. At the gates, a massive crowd of pack members had gathered. But they weren't fighting. They were standing in eerie silence, parting like the sea to let a small group pass through. It was the Hallowed. They walked with a strange, rhythmic grace, carrying baskets on their shoulders. They stopped at the center of the square, right beneath the king's gaze. "What is the meaning of this?" Kaelin shouted down. One of the cloaked figures stepped forward. He pulled back his hood, revealing a face that had been horribly scarred. A former soldier of Valerius's guard who had been dismissed after losing an arm in battle. "A gift," the man said, his voice carrying through the silent square. "From the queen to her people." He tipped the basket. Instead of severed heads or gold, thousands of white lilies tumbled onto the cobblestones. But as they touched the ground, they didn't wither. They began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. One by one, the townspeople reached out. A young girl, sickly and pale from the black water, touched a petal. Immediately, the color returned to her cheeks. She gasped, her eyes widening as her cough vanished. "It's healing them," Lyra whispered, appearing at Valerius's side. Her voice was filled with a terrifying realization. "She's not attacking the kingdom, Valerius. She's saving it." Valerius watched in mounting horror as his subjects, the people who were supposed to fear and obey him, began to pick up the flowers. They looked up at the palace, but they weren't looking at him with loyalty. They were looking at him as if he were the one holding the black water. "She's stealing the pack," Valerius whispered. The strategy was brilliant. He was prepared for a war of claws and teeth. He was prepared for a siege. He was not prepared for a war of hearts. By healing the people he had neglected, by providing for the weak he had discarded, Elara wasn't just a threat to his life. She was erasing his right to rule. "We have to stop them," Valerius said, his voice trembling with rage. "Guards, clear the square, confiscate those flowers." "Valerius, wait." Lyra tried to grab his arm, but he shook her off. "I will not have her undermining my authority in my own streets." The guards hesitated, looking at the peaceful crowd and the glowing lilies. But the Alpha's command was absolute. They moved forward, spears leveled. "Drop the flowers," the captain of the guard shouted. "By order of the king, these items are declared contraband of dark magic." The crowd didn't move. They looked at the guards, then at the lilies, then back at the king. The scarred man, the leader of the Hallowed, stood his ground. He picked up a single lily and held it high. "The king gives you iron," the man shouted. "The queen gives you life. Who do you serve?" The tension in the square was a physical weight. Valerius leaned over the battlements, his face a mask of fury. "I am your king," he bellowed. At that exact moment, the lilies changed. The soft white light turned a piercing, jagged blue. The flowers didn't explode, but they released a pulse of energy that knocked the guards backward, sending their spears clattering to the ground. And then the voice returned. Not a whisper this time, but a roar that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones. A king who fears his own people is already a corpse. The sky above the fortress split open, not with lightning, but with a tear in the fabric of the air itself. And there she was. Elara didn't fly. She descended on a staircase of shadows, her white hair billowing like a flag of surrender. But she wasn't the one surrendering. She landed in the center of the square, the crowd falling back in awe. She looked up at Valerius, 300 feet above her, and smiled. She raised a hand, pointing a single finger at him. "Valerius of Black Ridge," she called out, her voice amplified by the magic of the void. "I challenge you." A gasp went through the crowd. A mating bond challenge was ancient law. It was a trial by combat, but not for land or title. It was for the soul of the pack. "You have no standing," Valerius screamed back. "You are an outcast, a rejected mate." "I am the mate the moon gave you," Elara replied, her voice turning cold and sharp. "And I am the one you tried to kill. By the laws of the old blood, I claim the right of reckoning. Fight me, Valerius, or admit to your people that you are afraid of the girl you broke." Valerius looked down at the thousands of faces watching him. He saw the doubt. He saw the budding hope. If he didn't fight her, he was finished. If he did... He looked at his hand, at the rune of betrayal. It was glowing so brightly, now it was painful. He didn't have a choice. "I accept," he growled, the sound echoing off the stone walls. "And tonight, Elara, I will bury you in a grave that even the shadows can't find." The arena was the Circle of Ancients, a natural stone amphitheater at the base of the mountain. It was a place of power, where the ley lines of the earth crossed. The entire pack had gathered, thousands of wolves perched on the stone tiers, their eyes glowing in the dark. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and anticipation. Valerius stood at the northern end. He had stripped to his waist, his muscular torso covered in the ritual tattoos of his lineage. His wolf was clawing to get out, the golden fur already beginning to sprout along his spine. He was a mountain of muscle and apex fury. Elara stood at the southern end. She wore a simple dress of charcoal silk that moved like smoke around her legs. She carried no weapon. She had no armor. She just stood there, her white hair glowing like a beacon. "This is madness," Lyra whispered from the royal box. "He's going to kill her, or she's going to destroy the world trying to stop him." The high shaman stepped into the center, raising a staff of gnarled wood. "The reckoning has begun," the shaman intoned. "No interference, no mercy, until the bond is settled." With a roar that shook the earth, Valerius shifted. His transformation was instantaneous and violent. In a blur of gray and gold, a wolf the size of a grizzly bear stood where the man had been. His eyes were pure, molten gold, and his fangs were the length of daggers. He lunged. He was a streak of lethal speed, crossing the distance in 3 massive bounds. He launched himself at Elara's throat, his jaws open to end it in a single crunch of bone. Elara didn't move. At the last possible second, she whispered a single word. Still, the air in front of her solidified. Valerius hit an invisible wall with the force of a battering ram. The impact echoed through the arena. He fell to the ground, snarling in confusion. He scrambled up, circling her, his fur bristling. He lunged again, this time from the side, aiming for her legs. Elara simply stepped to the left, her movements fluid and hauntingly slow. As he passed her, she flicked her wrist. A lash of shadow matter struck Valerius across the flank. It didn't draw blood, it drew light. A trail of golden essence followed the lash, pulled directly from his body. Valerius let out a pained yelp, his form flickering. For a second he looked human again, his skin pale and sweating. "What's the matter, Valerius?" Elara asked, her voice calm as she circled him. "Is the big, bad wolf afraid of the dark?" He snarled, his eyes turning bloodshot. He forced the shift to hold, his muscles bulging as he fought the draining effect of her magic. He knew he couldn't play her game. He had to make it a physical fight. He roared, a sound that forced the listeners to cover their ears, and the ground beneath Elara's feet erupted. Massive shards of obsidian rose from the earth, driven by his alpha earth magic. They surrounded her, closing in like the teeth of a trap. Elara looked up at the jagged black glass. She reached out and touched one of the shards. "You always did like to build walls," she mused. She closed her eyes, and the blue runes on her skin began to bleed. Not red blood, but a glowing, ethereal ichor. "But you forgot one thing," she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a power that made the high shaman's staff crack. "Walls don't just keep people out, they keep you in." She slammed her palms against the obsidian. The shards didn't shatter. They turned into liquid. A river of molten black glass flowed toward Valerius, moving like a living serpent. He tried to jump, but the liquid rose up, catching his back paws. He roared in agony as the glass cooled instantly, pinning him to the stone floor. He was trapped. Elara walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the stone. She stopped just inches from his snarling face. She knelt, looking into his golden eyes. For a moment, the hatred was gone. There was only a profound, echoing sadness. "I loved you more than my own life," she whispered. Valerius struggled, his claws scratching uselessly at the obsidian. He began to shift back, his human face contorted in pain and rage. "You were weak," he wheezed, his voice bubbling with blood. "I was whole," she corrected him. "You were the one who was broken, Valerius. You were so afraid of a heart that you cut out your own. And now look at you." She placed her hand over his heart. The rune on his hand began to glow in sync with her palm. Valerius gasped, his back arching as a golden light began to pour from his eyes and mouth. "What are you doing?" he screamed. "I'm taking back the piece of me you stole," she said. "The bond doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the void." The light intensified, blinding everyone in the arena. A high-pitched hum filled the air, the sound of a soul being rewritten. And then, with a sound like a thunderclap, it stopped. Valerius slumped against the obsidian, gasping for air. He was alive, but he felt empty. The crushing weight of his alpha power, the connection to the pack, the roar of the wolf in his head, it was all gone. He was just a man. Elara stood up, her white hair glowing with a new, golden undertone. She looked out at the pack, her presence so immense that even the high shaman bowed his head. "The king is fallen," someone shouted from the stands. The queen of shadows." The cry began to take up, a rhythmic chant that shook the mountainside. Elara didn't look triumphant. She looked weary. She looked at Valerius, who was staring at her with a mixture of horror and realization. He reached out a trembling hand toward her. "Elara, please." She looked at his hand, then at his face. "You told me once that a king needs a sword, not a heartbeat," she said softly. She turned away from him, walking toward the exit of the arena. "I hope you enjoy the silence, Valerius. It's all you have left." The weeks that followed were a blur of revolution. Elara didn't sit on the obsidian throne. She didn't want it. She stayed in the ironwood, and the pack came to her. They built a new city among the trees, a place where the weak were protected and the magic of the earth was respected. Valerius remained in the fortress, but he was a king of nothing. Most of his guard had left. His sister, Lyra, acted as the regent, trying to keep the kingdom from collapsing entirely. Valerius spent his days in the library, searching for a way to get his power back. He was obsessed. He was a shell of a man, driven by the memory of the light he had lost. One night he was sitting by the fire, his hand, now scarred where the rune had been, clutching a glass of wine. "You won't find it in books." He spun around. Elara was standing by the window, the moonlight framing her. She looked more human now, her white hair having faded to a soft cream, the blue runes dimmed. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Come to finish the job." "I came to tell you a secret," she said, stepping into the firelight. Valerius laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "I don't want your secrets. You took my life. You took my pack. You took my wolf." "I took your pride," she said. "Your wolf is still there, Valerius. He's just hiding. He's ashamed of you." She walked over to him, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't smell like ash. She smelled like the girl she used to be. "The bond wasn't severed that night in the arena," she whispered, leaning down. "It was inverted." Valerius looked up at her, his heart skipping a beat. "Inverted? What does that mean?" "It means that as long as I am powerful, you will be weak," she said, her eyes searching his. "And as long as you hate me, you will stay this way." She reached out, her hand hovering over his. "But if you can find a way to love something more than your crown, if you can find a way to be the man I thought you were." "I don't know how to be that man," he whispered, his eyes filling with tears he hadn't shed in centuries. "Then learn," she said. She leaned in, her lips brushing his ear. "Because there is something coming, Valerius. Something from the wastes that makes me look like a summer breeze. And when it gets here, this kingdom will need a king who knows how to bleed for his people, not just lead them." She pulled back, looking him in the eye. "I'll be in the woods. When you're ready to stop being a victim of your own choices, find me." She vanished into the shadows, leaving him alone with the dying fire. Valerius sat there for a long time, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He looked at his hand. He looked at the door. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King felt a spark of something other than rage. He felt hope. But as he stood up to follow her, a dark, viscous liquid began to seep from under the door of his study. It wasn't ink. It wasn't blood. It was the same black water that had poisoned the wells. And from the shadows in the corner of the room, a pair of eyes opened. They weren't Elara's. They were red, the color of a dying sun, and they were filled with a hunger that had been waiting for 1,000 years. "The girl was right," a voice hissed from the darkness, a voice that sounded like grinding stones. "A king does need a sword." Valerius backed away, his heart hammering. "Who are you?" The figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall, skeletal, draped in armor made of human teeth. "I am the one she made the deal with," the creature said, tilting its head. "I am the price, and now that she has her revenge, I've come to collect the interest." The creature lunged, and the scream that tore from Valerius's throat was silenced by the darkness. High in the ironwood, Elara stopped. She clutched her chest, falling to her knees. A searing, white-hot pain tore through her soul. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Not yet, it's too soon." She looked back at the fortress, her breath hitching as a pillar of black smoke began to rise from the king's spire. The deal she had made in the wastes, the price for the power to return, wasn't just her soul. It was the soul of the thing she loved most. She had told herself she hated Valerius. She had spent 3 years fueling her magic with that hatred. But as the bond screamed in agony, she realized the terrible truth. The void doesn't care about hate or love. It only cares about the connection. And by reclaiming the bond in the arena, she hadn't just weakened Valerius. She had marked him as the sacrifice. "Valerius!" she screamed, her voice breaking. She began to run, her feet tearing at the earth, her magic flaring wildly around her. She didn't look like a queen now. She looked like a girl who was about to lose everything all over again. The shadows around her began to twist, turning against her. The hollowed, her faithful warriors began to change. Their eyes turned that same sickly, dying sun red. "The queen is failing," they whispered in unison, their voices a discordant hive mind. "The hunger is here." Elara blasted through them, her hands wreathed in blue flame. She didn't care about the pack. She didn't care about the crown. She had to get to him. But as she reached the gates of the fortress, she found them already open. Standing in the courtyard was Valerius. But he wasn't the man she had left in the study. His skin was gray, his veins standing out like black ink. His eyes were gone, replaced by twin pits of void fire. In his hand, he held a blade made of frozen screams. He looked at her, and for a split second, a flicker of the man remained in the depths of those terrifying eyes. "Run," he choked out, the word sounding like it was being torn from his throat. And then, the creature behind him, the thing made of teeth and shadow, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Why run?" the creature asked, its voice echoing through the entire valley. "The wedding is just beginning." The ground began to crack open, not just in the courtyard, but across the entire kingdom. The wastes were bleeding into the world, and the Alpha King was the gate. Elara stood her ground, her magic rising to meet the darkness, even as she felt her own strength being siphoned away by the creature. "I won't leave him," she shouted, her voice a defiant roar against the coming apocalypse. "Then stay," the creature laughed. "Stay and watch as your love destroys everything you tried to save." The darkness surged forward, a tidal wave of shadow and teeth, and Elara closed her eyes, reaching deep into the place where her heart and the bond met, looking for one last spark of the girl who had believed in fated mates. The battle for Black Ridge was no longer about a throne. It was about the price of a second chance. And the cost was going to be written in blood. The air between them didn't just vibrate, it curdled. The scent of lilies was gone, replaced by the sulphurous stench of a dying world. Elara stood her ground, the soles of her feet searing as the cobblestones of the courtyard began to glow with a sickly, subterranean heat. She looked at the thing that wore Valerius's face. It was like looking at a masterpiece that had been left in the rain until the colors ran into a nightmare. "Valerius," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread in the howling wind. "Fight it! I know you're still in there. The man who was too proud to love me. He was too stubborn to let a parasite win." The creature laughed, a sound like glass grinding against glass. It moved Valerius's head with a jerky, unnatural twitch. "Pride is a door, little queen," the entity hissed. "And he left it wide open the moment he tore the bond. You think your rejection was the end? It was the invitation. Every ounce of bitterness he felt, every drop of regret he tried to drown in wine and war. It fed me." The entity raised Valerius's hand, the one Elara had touched in the arena. The scar where the rune of betrayal had been was now a weeping wound of black smoke. "He didn't reject you because you were weak, Elara," the creature whispered, leaning forward. Valerius's voice flickered through the distortion, a ghost of its former resonance. Tell her why." Elara felt a coldness in her marrow that had nothing to do with winter. "What is it talking about, Valerius?" The man behind the mask of shadow let out a choked sound, a spasm of agony. For a fleeting second, the red fire in his eyes died down, replaced by a desperate human gold. "The prophecy," Valerius gasped, blood leaking from his nose. "The lineage of the Alpha Kings. It was cursed from the start. A fated mate. Isn't a gift, Elara. It's a lock. If I had claimed you, if I had truly bonded with you. The void would have taken us both that very night. I threw you away to keep you out of the dark." The revelation hit Elara harder than any physical blow. The 3 years of agony, the hatred that had become her heartbeat, the deals she had made in the wastes, all of it had been built on a foundation of a lie meant to protect her. He had played the villain to keep her a victim, never realizing she would grow into a catastrophe. "You fool," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "You thought you could outsmart the moon. You thought you could save me by breaking me." "I saved your life," Valerius wheezed, his body jerking as the entity regained control. "I didn't care if you hated me, as long as you were alive." The entity roared, its power surging. A shockwave of darkness threw Elara backward. She hit the stone wall of the keep, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp burst. Around them, the fortress was screaming. The wolves of the Black Ridge Pack were no longer soldiers, they were prey. The Hollowed were dragging them into the cracks in the earth, their screams echoing up from the depths of the wastes. Lyra appeared on the balcony above, her hands glowing with the faint, ancestral magic of their line, desperately trying to shield a group of terrified Omegas. "Elara," Lyra cried out. "The gates won't hold. It's siphoning the magic from the ley lines. If he stays in the center of the circle, he'll tear the world apart." Elara scrambled to her feet, her white hair matted with blood. She looked at the devastation. She looked at the man she had come home to destroy, only to find he had already destroyed himself for her sake. "I won't let it end like this," she said, her voice growing steady, resonant. She didn't reach for the void magic this time. She didn't call on the shadows or the cold. Instead, she reached for the one thing she had tried to bury in the deepest pits of her soul. She reached for the love. It was a small, flickering thing, nearly extinguished by years of spite. But as she touched it, the blue runes on her skin began to change. They didn't glow blue and they didn't glow gold. They turned a blinding, crystalline white, the color of a star being born. She walked toward the possessed king, each step a challenge to the darkness. "The price is paid," she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the entity flinch. "You wanted a soul, take mine, but leave his." The creature tilted Valerius's head, intrigued. "A trade. You would offer yourself to the void after all you've done to escape it." "I'm not offering myself as a slave," Elara said, stopping just inches from the blade of frozen screams. "I'm offering myself as a cage." She reached out and grabbed the blade with her bare hand. The ice hissed against her skin, but she didn't let go. She pulled herself closer until she was nose to nose with the monster wearing her mate's face. "Valerius," she whispered, her forehead touching his. "I reject your rejection. I claim you, not as a king, not as an alpha, but as mine." The bond, which had been a jagged, broken thing, suddenly flared into life. It wasn't a tether anymore. It was a bridge. A torrent of light poured from Elara into Valerius. It wasn't the healing light of the lilies. It was the raw, unfiltered essence of a fated mate's soul. It was every memory of their childhood, every soft word they had ever exchanged before the world turned cold, every dream they had shared under the ironwood trees. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. The black smoke began to pour out of Valerius's wounds, forced out by the sheer pressure of the light. "No," the creature roared. "This is not the deal. You cannot rewrite the price." "I am the Queen of Shadows," Elara snarled, her eyes burning with white fire. "I make the rules in the dark." The struggle was a physical weight in the air. The courtyard was a vortex of light and shadow, the two forces clashing with enough energy to level mountains. Valerius's body was the battlefield. He was screaming, his muscles tearing, his bones cracking under the strain of being the vessel for two warring gods. "Elara, stop," he managed to choke out. "It's too much. You'll shatter." "Then we shatter together," she cried out. Suddenly, the entity made a final, desperate move. It didn't try to stay in Valerius. It sensed the weakness in the bond, the lingering resentment Elara still held for the years of pain. It lunged at her. The black smoke abandoned Valerius's body in a single, violent surge, diving into Elara's chest. She gasped, her back arching as the darkness flooded her lungs. She fell to the ground, the white light in her runes flickering, turning a bruised, sickly violet. Valerius collapsed beside her, his human form broken and bleeding, but his eyes were his own again. "Elara!" He crawled toward her, his fingers scraping the stone. She was shaking, her skin turning gray, the black veins of the void spreading across her throat. She looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw the girl he had loved. "I caught it," she whispered, a dark, viscous liquid leaking from her lips. I trapped it inside." "Why?" Valerius sobbed, pulling her into his arms. He didn't care about his kingdom. He didn't care about the shadows. He only cared about the heartbeat fatting beneath his palms. "Why would you do this?" "Because you were right," she said, her voice fatting to a ghost. "A king needs a sword, and a queen needs to protect her king." But the victory was hollow. As the darkness settled within her, Elara's eyes began to change. The silver was gone. The gold was gone. They were turning into the same red pits of fire that had belonged to the creature. The entity wasn't gone. It had simply found a better host. A host with more power, more magic, and a deeper well of sorrow to feed upon. Elara's hand flew to Valerius's throat, her grip tightening with a strength that wasn't hers. "Kill me," she hissed, her voice overlapping with the grinding stone resonance of the void. "Valerius, while I can still hold it, kill me." Valerius looked down at the woman he had spent his life trying to save. He looked at the blade of frozen screams lying on the ground beside them. The kingdom was silent now. The Hollowed had stopped their assault, standing like statues in the courtyard, their red eyes fixed on their queen. The fate of the Black Ridge, and the world beyond, rested on a single choice. Could the Alpha King kill the only thing that made his life worth living? Or would he let her become the monster that would devour everything? Valerius picked up the blade. The ice was cold, but his heart was colder. He looked into her eyes, searching for a trace of the girl who used to bring him wildflowers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. But as he raised the sword, the shadows around them didn't retreat. They rose up, thicker and darker than ever before, forming a dome that cut them off from the rest of the world. And from the center of Elara's chest, a new sound began to emerge. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a roar. It was a heartbeat, a slow, heavy, thumping rhythm that vibrated in the stone beneath them. Thump, thump, thump. The void wasn't just taking her. It was changing. The combination of her light and its darkness was creating something new, something that the ancient prophecies hadn't foretold. A third power. Elara's eyes snapped open, and the red fire was gone. They were a brilliant, terrifying purple, the color of the sky just before the sun disappears forever. She reached up and caught Valerius's wrist, stopping the blade inches from her heart. "The price has been renegotiated," she said. Her voice was no longer human, but it wasn't the monster's either. It was the voice of the eclipse. She stood up, pulling Valerius with her. He looked at her in awe, sensing a shift in the very fabric of reality. "Elara." She didn't answer. She looked out at the ruins of her kingdom, at the dead and the dying, at the darkness that was still leaking from the cracks in the earth. She raised both hands, and the purple light exploded from her, a wave of energy that didn't destroy, but transformed. The black water in the wells didn't disappear. It turned into a shimmering, violet liquid that hummed with power. The wounded didn't just heal. They changed, their eyes taking on the same twilight hue as hers. She wasn't saving the world. She was claiming it. "The age of the Alpha Kings is over," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the mountain. "The age of the pack is over." She turned to Valerius, her expression unreadable. "The twilight has come, and you, Valerius, you will be my first knight, or you will be my first sacrifice. The choice is yours." The Alpha King looked at the woman he had broken, the woman who had returned as a god. He looked at the sword in his hand, then at the world turning purple around him. He dropped the blade. He knelt. Not because he had to, not because of a command, but because he realized that the girl he had tried to protect was gone, and the queen who remained was the only thing standing between them and total annihilation. "I serve the twilight," he whispered. Elara placed a hand on his head, her touch no longer cold, but vibrating with a strange, humming energy. "Then rise," she said. "We have a world to remake, and the wastes are still hungry." In the distance, beyond the borders of the Black Ridge, other eyes were opening. Other kingdoms were feeling the shift in the wind. The threat of the Alpha King had been neutralized, but a greater, more ancient threat had been born in its place. And as the purple sun began to rise over a transformed landscape, the true cost of Elara's return was only beginning to be understood. The curse of the fated mates hadn't been broken. It had evolved. And the hunger of the void was no longer outside the gates. It was sitting on the throne. The violet sun hung frozen in the sky, a bruised eye watching the transformation of the Black Ridge. It did not set, and it did not rise. It simply existed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the weeks that followed the reckoning, the kingdom became a place of beautiful, silent terror. The stone walls of the fortress had turned to a translucent obsidian, and the air carried the constant, low-humming vibration of Elara's power. There was no more hunger in the streets, no more sickness, but there was also no more laughter. The people moved with a rhythmic, trance-like grace, their violet eyes reflecting the soul of their queen. Valerius, the first knight of the twilight, stood on the high balcony where he had once looked down as a tyrant. He was stronger now than he had ever been as an alpha, his body infused with the ethereal ichor Elara provided. But every time he looked in a mirror, he didn't see a king. He saw a beautiful, gilded cage. "You're thinking of the way the sun used to feel," a voice whispered behind him. He didn't need to turn. Her scent, now a heady mix of crushed velvet, ancient dust, and something dangerously sweet, preceded her. Elara stepped onto the balcony, her gown appearing to be woven from the very night sky, stars flickering in the folds of the fabric. "I'm thinking of the day I met you," Valerius said, his voice a low rasp. "You were wearing a yellow ribbon. You were afraid of the mountain lions. I thought you were the most fragile thing I'd ever seen." Elara leaned against the stone railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the wastes met the sky. "Fragility is a luxury, Valerius, one you took from me, one I can never buy back." "I know," he said, turning to her. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he touched her cheek. Her skin was warm, but it felt like touching a live wire, the vibration of the void humming just beneath the surface. "But sometimes I look at you and I see her, the girl who loved wildflowers. I wonder if she's screaming inside." Elara's eyes softened, a flicker of the old gold appearing for a heartbeat before being swallowed by the violet. "She isn't screaming, she's sleeping, and it's better this way. The things I have to do to keep the void from devouring this world. She wouldn't have the stomach for it." She stepped closer, her hands sliding up his chest to rest over his heart. "Do you regret it? Staying? You could have fled while I was transitioning. You could have lived out your days as a human in the southern lands." Valerius covered her hands with his own. "I died the day I rejected you, Elara. Everything since then has just been a ghost waiting for its master. I would rather be your shadow than a king of a world without you." It was the confession he should have made years ago. It was the love she had once begged for. But now, it felt like a heavy weight, a debt paid in the wrong currency. "Then prepare yourself," Elara said, her voice turning cold. "The southern kingdoms are mobilizing. They see the twilight as a plague. They're coming with silver and holy fire. They think they can purify our people." "Let them come," Valerius growled, his wolf, now a monstrous thing of shadow and bones stirring in his mind. "I will pave the road to this mountain with their crowns." The war that followed was not a war of steel. It was a war of souls. The allied armies of the south marched upon the Black Ridge with 10,000 men, led by high priests who claimed to speak for the moon goddess. They brought mirrors to reflect the unholy, light, and salt to bind the shadows. But as they entered the Valley of the Ironwood, they found no soldiers waiting for them. They found only Elara. She stood in the center of the road, her white hair flowing upward as if she were underwater. Behind her, the air was fractured, tiny cracks leaking a humming, violet light. "Turn back," she commanded. Her voice didn't travel through the air. It spoke directly into the minds of every soldier, a resonance that made their teeth ache. "There is nothing here for you but the end." "Abomination," the high priest shouted, raising a golden scepter. "You are a stain upon the goddess's creation. You are a rejected soul who crawled back from the pit." Elara smiled, and the ground began to weep black ink. "The goddess didn't reject me," she said softly. "She was the one who opened the door. She was the one who told me that a heart is a weakness. She was the one who watched Valerius break the bond and did nothing." She raised her hand, and the violet sun above them flared. "If I am a stain," Elara roared, "then I shall be the ink that rewrites your history." The slaughter was instantaneous. The shadows of the soldiers detached themselves from their bodies, turning on their owners with jagged, shadowy claws. The salt turned to ash. The silver melted into the skin of those who wore it. Valerius watched from the ridgeline, his heart cold. He saw the woman he loved becoming a force of nature, a god of the end times. He saw the mercy die in her with every life she took. And he realized the final, terrible truth of their bond. The rejection hadn't just been a mistake. It had been a ritual. The void had needed a soul that was perfectly balanced between love and hate, between light and dark. It had needed an alpha's strength and an omega's heart, shattered and then fused back together by magic. The moon goddess hadn't been silent because she was indifferent. She had been silent because she was hungry. The war ended in a single afternoon. The southern armies were gone, their bodies absorbed into the earth to fuel the growing twilight. Elara returned to the fortress, her steps heavy. She walked past the bowing citizens, past the silent guards, and straight into the royal chambers. Valerius was waiting for her. He held a small, withered wildflower in his hand, the last one he could find that hadn't turned to crystal. "It's done," she said, leaning her head against the doorframe. She looked exhausted, her violet eyes dimming. "They won't come back. No one will ever come back." "Elara," Valerius said, stepping toward her. "Look at me." She looked up, and for the first time he saw the cracks. Literal cracks, glowing with white light, were appearing on her skin. She was breaking apart. The power was too much for a single vessel. "The price," she whispered. "The entity. It's not just inside me, Valerius. It is me. I can't hold it back much longer. The more I use the power, the more I disappear." "I'll take it from you," he said desperately. "I'll take half. We have the bond." "No," she said, touching his lips. "If you take it, we both become the monster. The world needs one of us to stay human. It needs one of us to remember what we were." She pulled him toward the bed, the obsidian walls of the room beginning to pulse with the rhythm of her failing heartbeat. "Love me one last time," she whispered. "Not as a queen, not as a knight, just as the boy and girl who used to dream of the stars." In the dim, violet light, the Alpha King and the Queen of Shadows held each other as the world outside began to dissolve into the final twilight. They shared a kiss that tasted of salt and eternity, a final bridge between two souls that had been broken, rejected, and reborn only to find that their destiny was to be the end of all things. The sun finally set. But it didn't leave behind a night. It left behind a void. In the center of the Black Ridge, where the fortress once stood, there was now only a towering spire of crystalline white stone, glowing with a soft, pulsing light. Inside that stone, two figures were visible, locked in an eternal embrace. The Alpha King and his greatest threat. The kingdom was gone. The people were gone. The wastes had been sealed, but the cost had been the reality of the world itself. But here is the final twist, the one the moon goddess never saw coming. As the years turned into centuries, and the world outside the valley began to regrow, a new legend began to circulate. They say that if you stand at the edge of the ironwood and listen very closely to the wind, you can hear a heartbeat. Not one heartbeat, two. Beating in perfect rhythmic sync. The bond hadn't been a cage, and it hadn't been a weapon. It had been an anchor. Elara hadn't been destroyed by the void, and Valerius hadn't been consumed by it. Together, in the silence of their crystalline tomb, they were doing something the gods thought impossible. They were purifying the dark. And one day, when the world is ready, the stone will shatter. The Queen of Twilight will walk out, and beside her will be the king who chose her over his crown. But they won't be coming back for a throne. They'll be coming back for the goddess who thought she could play with their lives. And this time, they won't be bringing flowers. They'll be bringing the end of the gods.